Get the equipment out there Saturday and demolish it before she notices. By the time the old woman files anything, it'll be a pile of gravel and her own problem. That was the voicemail. It was left for a contractor named Russ Cobb at 9:06 on a Thursday night, and the woman who left it was Diane Vetter, president of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association for the last 9 years. The thing she wanted gone before I noticed was the spring house. My grandfather built in 1948, the small stone structure that fed the only clean water to my orchard and to 4 families downhill from me. I am Hollis Mercer. I am 63 years old, and I spent 31 years as a water rights examiner for the state engineer's office before I retired to the 11 acres my family has held in this valley since before there was a county to record it in. What Diane did not know, when she left that message for a man who would later play it back for a room full of people who could end her, was that I had spent my entire working life reading the exact kind of document that governed that spring house. I knew what a recorded water right was worth. I knew what it meant that the priority date on mine was 1911. And I knew that a structure protecting a senior water right is not a shed you can knock down on a Saturday because the paperwork annoys you. She thought she was dealing with a widow who would cry and call a lawyer she could outspend. She was dealing with someone who had spent 3 decades watching people exactly like her lose. So, let me ask you something, before I tell you how it all came apart for her. If you had 30 years of knowing precisely how the law worked, and the person trying to take your family's water assumed you knew nothing at all, would you correct her early? Or would you let her keep building the case against herself one stupid decision at a time? Sit with that. I'll tell you what I chose. I moved back to the valley full-time this spring after my wife Carol died. We had always meant to retire here together. She had a way of standing at the kitchen window with her coffee, looking down the slope at the orchard her own grandmother had helped plant, and she used to say the water was the whole reason any of it lived. She was right about that. The valley looks lush from the road, but the soil is thin and the rain is stingy, and the only reason there is fruit on those trees in August is the spring that comes up cold and steady out of the hillside, runs through the stone house my grandfather laid by hand. My grandfather understood water the way I would later be paid to understand it. In 1911, he walked into the territorial office and filed for the use of that spring, and the clerk wrote it into the book, and that priority date has sat there ever since, senior to almost everything around it. In 1948, he built the spring house over the source to keep it clean, mortared fieldstone with a slate roof and a heavy door, and he ran the pipe down to the orchard and split it to serve the 3 cabins his brothers built below. By the time I inherited the place, those cabins had been sold off and rebuilt, but the water still ran to them because that is how it had always run, and nobody had ever questioned it. Then Cedar Ridge happened. 15 years ago, a developer bought up the old grazing land on the ridge above mine and put in a gated subdivision of big houses with 3-car garages and lawns that have no business existing in this climate. They formed a homeowners association, and over time, the association decided that its authority extended to everything it could see from the ridge, including a great deal of ground it had no claim to whatsoever. My 11 acres sit below the development, outside its boundary, on a deed that predates the subdivision by 90 years. I am not a member. I never signed anything. My land was never platted into Cedar Ridge. None of that mattered to Diane Vetter. I want to be fair to her, because the story only works if you understand she was not a cartoon. Diane had been president 9 years running, re-elected by people who liked that. She made the place look orderly. She drove a white SUV with a vanity plate. She wore a blazer to walk the trails, and she carried a clipboard the way some people carry a small dog. Her husband, Greg Vetter, ran the company that had built Cedar Ridge and was now trying to build its second phase on the slope between the development and my line. That second phase needed water, a lot of it, and the cheapest water in the valley was coming up out of my hillside through my grandfather's stone house under a right that was older than anything Greg could ever file for himself. I did not understand all of that on the first day. I understood it by the end. The first contact was polite, which is the part people forget. On a Tuesday in May, Diane drove down my gravel in the white SUV and got out with a clipboard and a smile, and she told me she wanted to talk neighbor to neighbor about beautification. She said the association was working on the valley's overall appearance, and that and here she paused to find the word my rustic outbuildings were a concern. She meant the spring house. I told her it was a spring house, that it protected a water source, and that it had stood since 1948. She wrote something down. She said she understood, and that she would bring it to the board, and that she was sure we could find a path to compliance. I had been retired for 2 years at that point, and I had forgotten how much I disliked that word, compliance, in the mouth of someone who has not read a single document. I started a folder that night, not because I was angry, though I was, but because 31 years of work had trained my hands to do it before my temper could decide otherwise. A plain manila folder, and on the tab I wrote the date and the words Spring House, and inside it I put a single page where I recorded what Diane had said and when she said it. By the end, there were more than 90. Let me tell you how I learned to keep a folder like that, because it matters to what happened. For 31 years, my job was to examine claims to water in this state, to walk the ground, read the old filings, measure the flow, and decide whether what a person said they owned matched what the record and the land actually showed. I had stood at 1,000 head gates with 1,000 certain people who turned out to be wrong because they had never once read their own deed. The job taught me that the loudest claim is almost never the oldest one, and that the oldest one, properly recorded and quietly defended, beats the loudest one every single time. I did not retire from that knowledge. It sits in your hands. The first notice came in June on association letterhead, informing me that my property was found to be in violation of community standards and that I was assessed a fine of $250. I read it twice. The letter did not cite a single covenant number, because there was no covenant that touched my land, because my land was not in their association. I filed it. I did not pay it, and I did not call them, because I had decided already that I would let the record build. That was violation. Notice number 1. I wrote the number on the folder tab. In July, a man I did not know came up my driveway in a polo shirt with a laminated badge clipped to his pocket, carrying a tablet, and announced he was there to conduct a compliance inspection of my water infrastructure. I asked him who he worked for. He said the association had retained him. I asked him for his license to inspect a water system, since that is a regulated thing in this state, and I happen to know exactly which agency issued that license, and exactly what the card looked like. He did not have one. He had a badge he had clearly ordered online, the kind with a star that means nothing. I told him he was standing on private property outside the association boundary, and that he could leave the way he came. He took photographs of my spring house on his way out, which I noted with the date on a fresh sheet. Fake inspector. 2. That same week, Carol's daughter, from her first marriage, my stepdaughter, was deep into her own life 2 states away, and the only person at the house with me, most days, was the kid. I should introduce him. His name is Tate. He is Carol's grandson, 15 at the time, and he had come to live with me the autumn after she passed because his own situation had gotten complicated in a way that is not mine to tell, and because a boy that age sometimes needs a quiet place and a lot of work to do. He had Carol's steady way of watching a thing before he spoke about it. He was the one who, when I told him about the fake inspector, asked the question that turned out to be the most important one anybody asked in the whole affair. He asked why the association cared so much about an old stone building on land that was not theirs. I did not have an answer yet. I told him I intended to find one. By August, the fines were arriving every 2 weeks like clockwork. Each one for a fresh, imaginary violation. Each one a little larger. Unapproved structure, non-conforming materials, failure to submit to inspection, failure to remit prior assessments. The total, on paper, crept past $2,000. I filed every one. I never sent $1. A neighbor of mine down the hill, a rancher named Pell who ran a few dozen head on the flat below my orchard and took water from the same line my grandfather had split off 100 years back, told me over the fence one evening that he had gotten letters too, and that his were threatening to cut off what they called unauthorized water diversion. That was the first time the word water appeared in any of their paper. I made a note of it. I was starting to see the shape of the thing. What I did next was the most ordinary thing in the world for a man who had done my job. And it was the thing that won the case, though it would be 2 years before anyone but me knew it. On a Wednesday morning, I drove to the county seat, walked into the recorder's office, and pulled the entire chain of title and the water records for my parcel and for the ground around it. The office smelled the way those offices always smell. Old paper and floor wax and the faint ozone of a copier that is run all morning. I had done this 10,000 times for other people's land. It felt strange to do it for my own. I sat at the public terminal with a legal pad and a cup of bad county coffee going cold at my elbow, and I copied out the priority date, 1911, and the recording references, and I pulled the plat that showed plainly that my 11 acres had never been included in the Cedar Ridge development, the boundary line drawn clean around me like water around a stone. Then, because I knew where else to look, I pulled the filings for Greg Vedder's company. And there it was. Phase 2 of Cedar Ridge had been submitted to the state for a water allocation 8 months earlier, and the application leaned on a source it described as an existing spring on adjacent ground. My spring. They had filed paperwork claiming a right to water they did not own, on the assumption, I suppose, that the existing structure and its existing right could be made to disappear before anyone. I drove home with the photocopies on the seat beside me, and I did not say much to Tate that night, except that I had found the answer to his question. They wanted the water. The fines, the inspector, the beautification talk. All of it was theater on top of a simple theft. Greg needed my grandfather's spring to make his second subdivision pencil out, and Diane was the instrument that was supposed to clear the way by making an old widow give up. I put the photocopies in the folder. The folder was getting thick. I labeled a second one. I should tell you that I was not without people. There is a tendency in these stories to make the wronged party a lone figure, and that is not how it was. There was a woman at the county recorder's office, Junie, who had worked there nearly as long as I had worked for the state, and who knew me from 100 professional crossings of paths, and when she saw what I was pulling and put it next to the Vedder application, she went very quiet and told me to make 2 copies of everything, and keep one somewhere that was not my house. I did. There was a young deputy named Marsh who I will come to. And there was Pell, the rancher, who, when I showed him that his water and mine came off the same century-old right, took off his hat and said a word I will not repeat, and then said he would swear to anything I needed him to swear to. The escalation took a turn in the fall. On a Saturday in October, Diane held what she called a special community meeting at the Cedar Ridge Clubhouse. And although I was not a member and had no standing to attend, the meeting was about me, so I went and stood in the back. The clubhouse was all new carpet and recessed lighting and a long table of cookies nobody touched, and the homeowners sat in folding chairs in their weekend clothes, and most of them, I think, had no idea who I was. Diane stood at the front in a coral jacket with a projector remote in her hand, and she put a photograph of my spring house up on the screen, blown up large and shot at an angle that made the old fieldstone look like a ruin. She told a room of 40 homeowners that an unpermitted and deteriorating structure on the valley's edge posed a safety and aesthetic hazard to their property values, and that the board was pursuing every available remedy to bring the parcel into compliance. She used my name. She called the place blighted, and a few heads nodded, because a photograph on a screen will make people believe nearly anything. She said, and I wrote this down standing up against the back wall with the folder open on my forearm, that the spring parcel was functionally part of our community, whether the deed says so or not, functionally part of our community. A man 2 rows from the front, older, in a flannel shirt that looked out of place among the golf polos, raised his hand and asked whether the association could really do anything about land outside the boundary. Diane smiled the way she smiled, the patient smile she used on anyone who slowed her down, and said the board had excellent counsel and was very confident in its position. The man sat back, not convinced, and I made a note of him too, because a doubter in a room is sometimes a witness later. That was the second time she said her piece out loud in front of witnesses. I had the first one on a notice and this one in a room of 40. I was patient. I was waiting for the third. I want to be honest about the cost of being patient, because it was not free, and I will not pretend it was. There were nights I sat at the kitchen table with the folder open and Carol's chair empty, across from me, and felt the anger sit in my chest like a stone I had swallowed. There were mornings I walked up to the spring house and put my hand on the cold stone my grandfather had set, and had to remind myself that the fastest way to lose was to do something loud. Tate saw it. He was 16 by then. One night, he sat down across from me in Carol's chair, which he did not usually do, and he said that his friends thought I should just sue them and be done with it, and he wanted to know why I would not. I told him that a lawsuit is a fight you pay for by the hour, and that the other side had more hours than I did. I told him that the record was already on my side, and that the smartest thing a man with a better hand can do is let the other player keep betting. He thought about that. Then he asked if he could help with the folder. From then on, he kept the log of dates in his own neat hand, and he was the one who started saving the cameras. The cameras came after the gate. In November, someone cut the chain on the upper gate that closed off the 2-track to the spring house, and I found fresh tire tracks turned around in the mud 40 feet from the structure, as if a truck had come up to look and then thought better of it. Nothing was damaged. The chain, though, was cut, and a cut chain is a different thing than a letter. I reported it to the sheriff's office, and that is how I met Deputy Marsh, who came out and looked at the gate and the tracks and wrote it up as criminal mischief, and who told me something I already knew but needed to hear from a uniform. He said that as long as the complaints kept coming in on association letterhead, his office had to log them and respond, regardless of whether they had merit. and that the way these things got resolved was by building a documented pattern. He said, if I could show a course of conduct, a string of incidents tied to one motive that changed everything. He did not know yet what I had in the second folder. I did not show him. Not yet. I did buy 4 trail cameras that week, and Tate set them in the trees around the spring house and the gate, 2 angles each. And we ran them to cards we pulled every Sunday and copied to 2 drives. One drive lived at Pell's. The winter was quiet, which I have learned is the dangerous kind of quiet. The fines kept coming. The total on paper passed 5,000. In February, a process server delivered me a lawsuit, the association against me, demanding that I remove the unpermitted structures and grant access for inspection, and pay the accumulated assessments, and seeking an injunction. The server was a polite young man who looked embarrassed to be standing in my snow, and he handed me the envelope and said he was sorry and meant it. And I told him it was not his doing and gave him a coffee for the road. I read all 11 pages at the kitchen table with the wood stove ticking and Tate doing his homework across from me in Carol's chair. It was a thin document for all its threats. It cited covenants that did not bind me, attached an HOA rulebook for a community I did not belong to, and demanded inspection of infrastructure it had no right to inspect. It never once mentioned water, and it never once mentioned the 1911 priority date, because to mention either would have been to admit the thing they were actually after and the thing that beat them. They were betting that I would either fold or hire a lawyer and bleed money into a fight over a shed. Tate read it after me slowly, and when he was done, he set it down and said it did not even mention the spring, and I told him that was the most important sentence he had said all year. I filed the lawsuit in a folder. I answered it myself, briefly denying their jurisdiction and noting that the parcel lay outside the association boundary, and I attached one document, the plat. I did not attach the water right. Then came the spring and the voicemail. Here is how I came to have it, because that matters too. Russ Cobb, the contractor Diane called, was a local man who had done honest work for honest people in the valley for 20 years, and who had also, in a leaner stretch, done some grading for Greg Vedder's company. When Diane left that message on his phone, telling him to take his equipment up and demolish my spring house on a Saturday before I noticed, Russ did not do it. Russ sat in his truck and listened to it twice, and then he drove to Pell's place because Russ and Pell had known each other since grade school, and he played it for Pell, and Pell called me. I drove over. I sat in the cab of Russ's truck, and I listened to Diane Vedder's voice tell a man to destroy the structure protecting a senior water right before the old woman could file anything. Demolish it before she notices. By the time the old woman files anything, it'll be a pile of gravel and her own problem. I asked Russ if he would let me have a copy. He was quiet for a while. Then he said that he had grown up drinking water that came down off that hill, and that he was not going to be the man who knocked the spring house down, and that I could have whatever I needed. We saved the voicemail 3 ways that night. Tate handled it. He was the one who knew how to pull the audio file off clean and write it to the 2 drives, and he set the original aside untouched. He was 17 by then, and steadier than men, twice his age. When it was done, he looked at me across the kitchen and asked if this was the thing we had been waiting for. I told him. It was close. I told him the voicemail was the proof of intent, but that intent alone does not win. That what would win was the intent laid down next to the document. The 1911 right next to the order to destroy it, in front of someone whose job was to recognize what that meant. He nodded slowly. He understood the difference. Most people never do. I did not call the sheriff that night, and I did not call a lawyer because I knew where the right venue was. The state engineer's office, my old office, holds a hearing on every water allocation application before it is granted, and Greg Vedder's Phase 2 application was set for its hearing in 6 weeks at the county building, a public proceeding before a hearing officer whose entire function is to weigh competing claims to water. I had sat at the side of that very room for 31 years. I knew the hearing officer who would be presiding, a careful woman named Adler who had started the same year I did, and who did not suffer a sloppy claim. I knew that Greg's whole application rested on the existence of an available spring on adjacent ground, and I knew that I, as the holder of the senior right that spring fed, had standing to appear and object. I filed my notice of objection the next morning, 1 page. I did not lay out my evidence. I simply entered my appearance and my priority date, 1911, and I let them spend 6 weeks wondering how much I knew. In those 6 weeks, the fines kept coming, which tells you how little they understood what was about to happen to them. The total passed $7,000 on paper. None of it ever collected, a number I would say out loud at exactly the right moment. Diane drove down my gravel one more time in early April and stood at my gate and told me through the bars that she was prepared to make all of this go away. The fines, the lawsuit, all of it, if I would simply sign a small easement granting the association access to maintain the water infrastructure for the benefit of the community. She had it printed and ready on the clipboard, a pen clipped to the top, and she held it out over the gate, the way you offer a treat to a dog you do not quite trust. The kitten heels she had worn were already sunk a little into the soft gravel, and a smear of valley mud had found the hem of her slacks, and she kept shifting her weight to keep her balance, and not once did she seem aware of how out of place she looked standing at a working gate in clothes meant for a showroom. I took the paper and read it where I stood. It was an easement that would have handed Greg the spring, dressed up in the language of maintenance and community benefit, and it would have done in one signature what 2 years of fines had failed to do. I handed it back. I told her no. Her face changed. Then the patience falling off it all at once. She told me I was a stubborn old man who was going to lose everything fighting over a pile of rocks, and that the spring parcel was functionally part of their community and always had been. That was the 3rd time. Different setting, same words, and this time a trail camera mounted on the gate post caught all of it with the date burned in the corner, and her own voice carrying clear across the still morning air. 3 voiced moments in 3 places on the record. I thanked her for coming. She did not understand why I was thanking her, and she got back in the white SUV and reversed too fast up the gravel. And I stood at the gate and watched the dust settle and felt, for the first time in 2 years, that the waiting was nearly over. The morning of the hearing was bright and clear, the kind of high spring light that makes the whole valley look washed. I put on the one good jacket I owned. Tate wanted to come, and I let him, because a boy should see how a thing is properly done, and because he had earned it. We drove to the county building, with the folders in a banker's box on the back seat, and Pell followed in his own truck, and Russ Cobb followed in his, and Junie from the recorder's office had said she would be there, and even Deputy Marsh, off-duty, came and stood at the back, in plain clothes because I had finally the week before told him what I had. The hearing room was the same beige room I had spent half my life in. Adler sat at the front. Greg Vedder sat at a table with his engineer and his lawyer, and Diane sat behind them, in a bright magenta blazer, with her clipboard on her knee. And when she saw me come in with a banker's box, she leaned over and said something to the lawyer, because a banker's box from an old widow probably looked to them like the flailing of someone in over her head. The application was presented first. Greg's engineer walked Adler through Phase 2, the lots, the projected demand, and the water source. And he put up a map, and on the map was my hillside, labeled as an available spring on adjacent parcel. Adler asked. In the flat way she asks things, whether the applicant had confirmed the status of the existing right on that source. The engineer said it was their understanding that the source was unencumbered. Adler made a note. Then she called for objections, and I stood up. I want to tell you exactly what happened next, because it happened slowly, and the slowness was the whole point. I walked to the front. I did not make a speech. I have heard 1,000 people make speeches in that room, and I have watched every one of them lose to a person who simply laid down a document. I set the banker's box on the table. I took out the first thing, the certified copy of the 1911 filing with the priority date, and I handed it to Adler, and I said that the source the applicant had described as unencumbered was the point of diversion for a water right recorded in 1911, senior to every right in the Cedar Ridge development by more than a century, and that I was its current holder by inheritance, and that the chain of title was the second document. I handed her that. The room was very quiet. Adler read the priority date and looked up over her glasses, not at me. Then I took out the third thing. I said that the structure the applicant needed to disregard, and that the Homeowners Association had been attempting through fines and a lawsuit to compel me to remove, was the spring house that protected that 1911 source, built in 1948, and that there had recently been an explicit instruction to destroy it. I asked the hearing officer for permission to play a 31-second recording. Greg's lawyer was on his feet fast, objecting, asking what this had to do with a water allocation, and Adler looked at him and said that the integrity of the source was squarely within the scope of the hearing, and that she would hear it. Tate, beside me, had it ready on a small speaker. He pressed the screen. Diane Vedder's voice came out into that beige room, clear as the day it was recorded. Get the equipment out there Saturday and demolish it before she notices. By the time the old woman files anything, it'll be a pile of gravel and her own problem. Nobody moved. I have been in a lot of quiet rooms, and that was the quietest. Greg Vedder had gone the color of paste. Diane had half risen out of her chair with her mouth open, and the clipboard slid off her knee and hit the floor with a flat crack that was the only sound in the room. The lawyer was looking at the table. Adler set down the certified copy of the 1911 filing very gently, the way you set down something you do not want to damage. And she looked at the recording device, and then she looked at Diane, and she asked for the record, who was speaking on the recording. Nobody answered for a moment. Then Russ Cobb stood up in the third row and said plainly that the voice was Diane Vedder's, that the message had been left on his phone, and that he was the contractor she had instructed to do the demolition, and that he had declined. I did not say anything else. I did not need to. I want you to understand that this is the whole craft of it. The document does the work. The voice does the work. You do not have to. The senior right was recorded in 1911. The order to destroy the structure protecting it had been given a few weeks earlier. The gap between those two dates was 114 years, and everyone in that room could feel the size of it. Adler called a recess. When she came back, she did 3 things in a row, in the dry voice of someone reading from the only conclusion the facts allowed. She denied the Phase 2 water application in full, finding that the source it relied upon was encumbered by a senior right and was not available for appropriation. She noted for the record that evidence had been presented of a deliberate attempt to destroy infrastructure protecting that senior right. And she stated that she was referring the recording and the related materials to the county attorney. Because the destruction, or attempted destruction, of works protecting a water right is not a homeowners association matter. It is a criminal one. And she directed that a copy of her findings be transmitted to the association's council, with a note that the parcel in question lay wholly outside the association's jurisdiction, and that any further assessment against it would be without legal basis. $7,400 in fines assessed against me, not $1 of which I ever paid or ever would. A water right, recorded 114 years before the order to destroy it. Those were the two numbers, and they sat in the record next to each other where anyone could see the gap. The consequence found its own way home, the way it does when a scheme is built on a thing that was never true. Without the water, Phase 2 of Cedar Ridge could not be built, and the financing Greg had lined up against the projected lots collapsed within the month. The county attorney did take up the recording, and while I am not in the business of predicting what a prosecutor will do, I can tell you that Diane Vetter resigned the presidency of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association 11 days after the hearing in a brief letter. Facing the hearing officer's findings and the prospect of having authorized action against, Land had never had any claim to, declined to pursue its lawsuit any further, and quietly let it die. The white SUV went up for sale that summer. The vanity plate, I noticed, did not come with it. I did not gloat. There was no one to gloat to, and gloating was never the point. The point was, the water kept running, cold and steady, out of the hillside, through my grandfather's stone house, with the slate roof and the heavy door, down the gravity line to the orchard and onto Pell's Flat, and to the families below, the way it had run since 1911, and the way it would run after I was gone. The evening after the lawsuit was dismissed, Tate and I walked up the 2-track to the spring house. The chain was back on the gate, a new, heavier one. We did not say much. He put his hand on the cold stone the way I do, the way I had seen Carol do, and he stood there a while in the last of the light. Then he said that he understood now why I had waited, and that he had not at the time. I told him that waiting is only worth anything if you are using the time to build, and that we had spent 2 years building the simplest thing in the world, which was a true account of what happened, kept in order, with the dates right. He asked if he could keep the folders. I told him they were his. He is going to study water law. He told me that the week after the hearing, and I will not pretend my eyes were dry when he did. So here is the lesson. Plainly, because I promised you one, and because it is the only part of this that can do you any good. If you own land and water in this country, go and read your own deed and your own water right today, before anyone makes you. Walk your boundary against the recorded plat and know exactly where your line is, because the person who comes for it will be counting on you. Not knowing, when a letter arrives that frightens you, do not answer it with your temper. Answer it with a folder. Write down the date. Write down who said what. Keep the originals, and put a copy somewhere that is not your house. Talk to your neighbors, because the same people who come for your water are usually coming for theirs too. And a swearing witness is worth more than a clever argument. And when you finally hold the better document, do not wave it around. Lay it down quietly in front of the one person whose job is to recognize it, and let it do the work. The loud claim is almost never the oldest one. The oldest one, recorded and patiently defended, wins. If you have a story like this one, a fence line, a gate, a well, a right somebody tried to take, put it in the comments, because I read them, and so do the people who need to hear. They are not the only ones. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one. And the next one is about a man who bought a mountain cabin at the end of a private road and the board that voted to pave that road and bill him $40,000 for the privilege, not knowing that the road had been deeded to him, every foot of it, by the man who built it. I will see you then. Keep your records. Walk your line.